All right, hi everybody, John Meadows here, and today I wanted to talk about stretching. So, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? What kinds of stretching are there? Today we're going to focus on static stretching. So, appreciate you tuning in, and here we go. All right, hi everybody, John Meadows here, and today I wanted to talk about stretching. We just put a video out a couple days ago on my favorite 10 lower body stretches, and I thought it would be good to just talk about stretching in general. Now there's lots of different kinds of stretching. There's PNF stretching, dynamic stretching, static stretches, there's other stuff, but again, today I want to focus on static stretching. It's a really interesting topic because I think about when I was growing up in sports and track and football, we did a lot of static stretching. And, through the years, at some point, people started challenging the idea that it's even valuable at all. So I think when you talk about static stretching, the first thing you got to do is you got to figure out why would you do it? What do people think are the benefits of stretching? And one of the benefits is, I think probably the biggest one, is an increased range of motion. So your muscles can move, they can move further, your joints aren't as tight. So does static stretching really improve your range of motion? Do your muscles actually get more flexible? And that has really come under attack. And a lot of people would say that temporarily the muscle appears to be more flexible, but then the muscle kind of returns back to its state of tightness like a day later. And I would say that I think flexibility, first of all, I think people underestimate how much it's predicated on genetics. I think genetically some people are just more flexible than others. The other thing I would say is I've known plenty of people in my lifetime that have increased their flexibility, but they had to stay at it. They had to be real consistent. And I've done that myself. I remember seeing Flex Wheeler do the splits when he was competing, and even Ronnie Coleman did the splits. And Tom Platz was able to get into a position where I still can't believe his hip flexors and quads were that flexible, where he could literally be on his knees and fold all the way backwards with his back touching the ground. So I think so I saw those things and I said, I'm going to make myself more flexible. So, I was in a gym that was also a Kung Fu studio, and he had one of those machines where you could put your legs in it and crank this thing and it would spread your legs out and make your groin more flexible so you could do the splits. And it worked. Like when I did it every day, every week, it worked. But the one thing I will say is when you stop stretching and when you don't do it for a couple weeks or whatever, I do tend to think your body goes back to kind of its normal state. I don't think you really maintain that flexibility. So the question again was, does stretching increase your range of motion? And I think it can if you're very consistent. But I think if you're not consistent, it probably doesn't do a good job. The other reason why people would stretch, people do it because they think it relieves soreness, it relieves DOMS. That's another thing that I don't think has ever really been proven. I think a lot of people stretch after a workout and they just feel a little better. And it is nice because if you're calm and you're breathing through your diaphragm and things like that, you activate your parasympathetic nervous system, basically all those things that kind of calm you down and bring you out of that fight or flight state. So from that perspective, it's very good, but does it actually prevent muscle soreness? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Probably not a real compelling case there. The third reason why people would stretch would be improved performance. And like if you think of somebody who needs to have a certain range of motion in their activity that they're doing, an increased range of motion would allow them to perform better. A more flexible muscle might be able to produce more power, for instance. So it's probably good for a sprinter, for example, to have some flexibility in that case. And this is another one that I think you got to be really careful, because increasing your range of motion temporarily could increase somebody's performance, but now's when you get into all the arguments. A lot of people will say, well, there's many studies that show that a lot of static stretching before an event actually causes muscle weakness. And I would say that is true, but then you have to ask a whole nother set of questions. So if you look at those studies, Were they done in 30 seconds? Was it 60 seconds? Was it 15 seconds? And what you'll notice is that the longer stretches, the 60-second stretches, for example, are the ones that inhibited performance. And then you got to say, well, would that same problem occur with a 15-second stretch? Maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't, but probably not. Then you got to ask yourself, well, how quickly were they doing the activity right after the stretch? And what I've seen in many of the studies was they did the stretch and then immediately went into the activity. And not a lot of people do that. You don't come out of a hard 60-second stretch and then boom, go right into your activity. So, and another thing to keep in mind, what about the person actually doing the stretching? Is it like a heavily muscled bodybuilder, or is it somebody who's thin and naturally flexible as is? Well, maybe the heavily muscled bodybuilder could use a little bit more range of motion as opposed to the other person who already has the range of motion. They're already flexible. So what further benefit are they going to get by a lot of hard stretching? It's debatable. I'm not on the far side that says stretching is bad, but I'm also not on the other side that says it's awesome. I think, like with anything else, it comes down to the person. Take me, for example. So I'm going to give you some of my experience. I had a real bad piriformis problem. That's a little muscle that crosses your glute. And if you have problems with that, it's very painful. I had it so bad, all the muscles around it, even my glutes, had actually shut off and I couldn't even fire. Very painful. I couldn't go up and down any stairs, not even one step. It was the most painful thing I've ever had. I thought I would never squat heavy again. I had to get cortisone shots from Dr. Soreness to even be able to train. I was preparing for nationals. This was actually in 2002. And it was in excruciating pain. And I took all kinds of treatment. I went, I had ART, MAT done, all kinds of stuff. The things which I like, by the way, but for that particular issue, they didn't help. And then one day I was stretching and I was laying on my back and I was letting my leg cross over me into an L shape. I actually did this stretch in the last video. And I noticed the pain in my hips felt a little better. It was a little bit better. And then I'd stretched again a couple days later and it got better. And after about 2 weeks of that stretching, the hip pain I had went away. It absolutely went away. And that kind of leads me to the fourth reason, which is injury prevention. I believe that for me, stretching really helped with injury prevention. I guess you could call it injury treatment. But, and even now, and that stuck. As long as I was doing that stretch, every once in a while, it didn't even need to be every week. My hips stayed really good. Now I'll do the stretches on occasion when I feel some hip tightness. If I don't, the tightness gets worse and worse and worse. It becomes quite painful. But as long as I'm doing it, every month or two, my hips actually stay pain-free. I'm still really tight in that area, but at least they stay pain-free. So for me, I personally saw a benefit with injury prevention, and it was really beneficial for me. Another thing is I've worked a lot on shoulder flexibility, and since I've done that, I feel like the pain in my shoulders is a lot better. My range of motion is really, really good in my shoulders. So, and then you look at people's lifestyles today. They sit for long periods of time. Their hip flexors get tight. They have lower back issues. Their glutes are weak. But I think people's lower back and their hip flexors, just from sitting so much, like I'm doing right now, can create problems. So if you can get your hip flexors a little bit looser, I think there's something that can be said for improving your posture, which can improve injury prevention, can probably relieve some lower back pain. So I think in today's society, especially, stretching can really help those kinds of issues, and it's really prevalent. I have a friend that's a chiropractor that I went to see because I was having some pain right in the middle of my back, right in the thoracic vertebrae. And after a lot of discussion, we came to the conclusion, and I agreed with him, that the problems I was having was because I sit like this too much, from typing on the computer and looking at my phone. Literally sitting like that was causing some issues in my spine. So I had to do first of all, I had to improve my posture. So, sit up straighter, start looking at my phone this way instead of this way, put my keyboard up a little higher. And I actually started doing some thoracic vertebrae type stretching, twisting movements to help. And now the pain's it's went away. So I think injury prevention for me was my number one reason for doing stretching, static stretching. And then sometimes I think I just feel better. It's probably placebo effect or something like that, but I don't care. I just feel better when I leave the gym. And it probably goes back to that bringing yourself down into that relaxed state and so forth. So I think, there's a lot of good debate. There's a lot of science that would say that static stretching is useless. I would disagree with that. I would say that in some cases it's beneficial. And what I want to tell you is experiment with it. I experimented with those really hard stretches before training, and I'll give you some examples of what I did. When I read things, I take them to heart, and I study. I always study, but it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to take it as black and white and it applies to me. I like to experiment, and I hope you all like to experiment too. So anyways, I was reading that Tom Platz, and this was years ago, was talking about one of the reasons he can squat deep is because of his ankle flexibility. And one of the things he did was he sat in a seated calf raise before he squatted to get his ankles looser. So I did that, and I would do 60-second stretches. And when I went to squat, it was amazing. I could definitely get down further. But my body wasn't used to that range of motion, and I injured my lower back. So it was one of those things where, okay, it worked, but now I was in a range of motion my body wasn't used to, so be careful. So you can do things to enhance your range of motion before you train, but be a little careful too. I also did some really hard hip flexor and glute stretching, 60-second hard stretches before I squatted, and I actually lost stability. So I think it's a double-edged sword. I think getting a little better range of motion is good, but then when the joint starts to become hypermobile, that hypermobility where the joint doesn't have that stiffness, now I think as a person lifting weights really hard, you can injure yourself. You can be careful. So long story short, what I do now is I do my static stretching after I train. And I'll typically do probably 20-second stretches, sometimes 30 seconds. All the research I've read shows that 20 or 30-second stretches are just as good as 60-second stretches. So I tend to do that. I do a couple stretches for each muscle. Nothing crazy intense, just enough to where you can kind of feel a little bit of pain, but then you can hold it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's all kinds of other stretching we can talk about, and we'll do that in other videos, dynamic stretching, PNF stretching, which I've done a lot of as well. And my thoughts today are more regarding weightlifting and bodybuilding. So for those of you who are going to the gym and lifting weights, if you are an athlete, my recommendations might be a little bit different. And that's specifically where we'll talk about some dynamic stretching. The other thing I wanted to mention too, because I think I glazed over it, was people think of stretching as a warm-up. I don't necessarily think of stretching as a warm-up. I think of muscles contracting, delivering fluid and blood to the joints and to the muscles and the whole area. I think that's more of a warm-up. So like, for example, if I was going to squat, a good warm-up on squats would be light squats. Just get a light barbell and squat, as opposed to doing some really hard stretches. So I tend to favor doing the exercise that I'm going to be doing with a very light weight and just driving blood into the muscle as my warm-up. And if you do that carefully and over a full range of motion, you're probably going to get the benefit, the warm-up that you need out of it. And then also, there's also a good question you can ask: if you're training with a full range of motion, will that enable your range of motion to be just as good anyway as if you were doing the static stretch? So in other words, let's say you're training hamstrings. Do you need to do the hard static stretch before you do the movement? Or could you just do some light work of stiff-legged deadlifts, for example, light with a nice full range of motion? And I would argue that just you can use the exercise and go through a full range of motion, and you don't need the static stretches, is where I'm at. But again, I think the static stretches at the end seem to provide some injury benefit for me. I feel better. I'm not going to say it's the end-all be-all, but I definitely feel comfortable telling you guys that I want you to experiment with it and try it. And maybe you'll get some benefits out of it, maybe you won't. But I definitely think it's something you should look into, and don't believe all the stretching is garbage, it's a waste of time. I don't think it is a waste of time. So anyways, that's it. Let me know what you think. Some personal experiences maybe you've had with static stretching. And I appreciate you listening as always. And we'll see you next time.